You could just pick up a random big name in the DSBM scene and listen to that, but you chose to watch a minute-long video about it, and I respect your grind, honestly. This is just a video I wanted to have 3 years ago when I was just getting into DSBM. So this video is meant to be a somewhat comprehensive guide on where to start from when you're getting into DSBM. If you don't want to watch the whole thing, just skip the structure and figure it out from there. The target audience is people who are new to DSBM, but if you are experienced, there might still be some bands that you might not know. I won't go over how the genre is defined in depth. What I will say is that DSBM, of course, focuses on themes of depression and common devices to achieve that depressing feeling are repetition and shrieking and crying vocals, and of course strong and repetitive melodies. There are also some playlists, a lot of which include more melodic DSBM. I've linked them in the description so you can check them out. Those should be an easy listen for most people, but if you think you're up for the challenge, I've also linked one of the most extensive DSBM playlists on Spotify. Of course, I've also created a playlist with the songs I mentioned in the video. It's all linked in the description, so check it out. And just a couple of disclaimers before we get into the video. I've done some censoring, but naturally there's a lot of talks about enlivening yourself. Keep that in mind. Also, I will butcher a lot of names, so I'm sorry, especially to any Brazilian or Norwegian folks out there. And last things last, you'll probably disagree with me on a lot of my picks, but I'd like to hear you out, so just mention what acts you like in the comments below. One very important thing before we start, I didn't base my list on popularity. Just keep that in mind. A lot of these picks are just my personal favorites from a given niche. So while I was doing research for the video, and even before that, I started noticing some patterns. So I decided to make the whole thing into Iceberg that I've split in two bigger parts, into chapters. So I'll also start off with the most accessible layers first, and then the further we go, the less accessible it gets. Each layer of the iceberg is sorted by accessibility and descending order. So the most accessible acts first, and then the more inaccessible. Down the bottom it gets kind of muddy because a lot of the artists are kind of quirky. I'll talk about how I've further subdivided two parts when we get to them. And just for the record, the layers are not real subgenres. I made them up, even if some of them kind of sound like subgenres. The first chapter is aimed at the general rock and metal crowd. It contains a lot of non-DSBM artists that have elements that are also used in DSBM. The rest are DSBM artists that incorporate elements outside of black metal, usually just common rock and metal elements. There are even some artists that are just DSBM but more palatable to non-black metal listeners. The second part is for black metal fans and people who already like some bands from the first chapter. That's not strictly the case, but if you're neither, as we go down, you'll probably start disliking most of the artists. Right, now let's get into the actual meat and potatoes of the video. This chapter is a preparation for the actual subject of the video, DSBM. We'll start off with a lot of non-DSBM acts, but as we near the end of the chapter, more and more DSBM artists are going to start popping up. There are 4 layers in here. Each is sort of representing a fusion of a genre and DSBM. I mean, that's not the exact definition of each layer, but you'll see what I mean. The first one is rock, second one's punk, third one's metal, and final one's doom, which, yes, I do know doom is a metal subgenre. It just differs quite a lot from generic metal. This layer is basically made up of ambient, post-black, and black gaze. I decided to include bands based on the stylistic choices they make, with their ambiances, their vibe, I guess, and how good a stepping stone they are, which, I mean, generally is the case for all layers in the first chapter. I'll start us off with Amasaurus and their self-titled. They're a great gateway band because they ease you into the DSBM atmosphere without being all that heavy. They're also a good appetizer for the rest of the first chapter. A lot of the artists in here build on their sound, sort of develop it more, I guess. They are kind of like the bass post-rock. Next up, we got Glacius by Syndrome. The record is on the lighter side, for sure, even for post. They're even like post-rock, I'd say. The guitars almost even sound clean. The vocals are pretty neutral, not too high or too low, and they're like some of the least abrasive screams I've heard. In the same vein as Syndrome, we have Inoven. Their vocals are a bit more personal preference. They aren't as accessible as Syndrome, but the songs are much longer, which generally helps set up the atmosphere, the depressive atmosphere. And both the Syndrome record and the Inoven record are EPs, but one's almost 30 minutes longer. Esperam can be considered post-rock, Russian doomer, terminally online ambient, or generally whatever you'd like to call them. Their album Funny Absurd Catastrophe is a mix of all of the above, and they somehow manage to glue it all together. Insomnia by A Light in the Dark hammers home the slow and drony song structure, which is prevalent in DSBM, and there are similar lyrical themes as in Depression, but they still manage to retain a lot of that post-black accessibility. They even have some songs which I can only describe as depression beats, like On My Own, or the Let It Guide You outro. A bit more on the weirder side, we got Dreaming Skies by Loha Karman. Luminescate is pretty black metally, but the rest of the record is pretty chill, and there are a lot of acoustic songs. I'd say the rest of the record is lighter than bands we've talked about already, but Luminescate compensates for that. Now at last, we got the first DSBM artist in the DSBM video, and that's Enter Teaser with the EP Days Not Lived in Letter. Though the EP is DSBM, it employs a very mild and ambient sound to get their point across. It really works well. the chill atmosphere. The production, it's very mellow. The drums are toned down, which is common in more ambient genres. And the guitars are distorted, but nowhere near black metal levels. And yes, of course, there are shrieks, but they're buried beneath the guitars and synths. And if you aren't a fan of that type of singing, the shrieks won't be an experience for you. The next two bands are two very common gateway DSBM bands. Even though, I mean, DSBM fans don't consider either DSBM, but yeah, still. My personal gateway was a body. Their sound is even milder than most of the previous bands, except for one thing. They use the crying / whimpering vocals, which that's how I got into those type of vocals, but their sound is very much like post-rock, kind of dabbling into black gaze. I Want to Be There by Sadness introduces you to a noisier sound. The songs are very dreamy and very repetitive, which is another DSBM cliche, though they're milder and more palatable. Getting into Sadness will open your eyes to the, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, to the Damien Oyeda cinematic universe. They have an ungodly amount of side projects, and a good chunk of which have similar sound to Sadness. There are also a bunch of other bands that have similar sound to Sadness, but aren't by Damien Oyeda. And these bands range from post-black to DSBM. The Sadness sound is a staple in those genres. Like the whole dreamy, repetitive 8 to 10 minute long songs. Lastly, Zathrides. They sort of fit the DSBM moniker, but they're on the lighter side of things. Their sound is built on basic sounding guitar riffs with the ethereal synths on top, and they're backed by some pretty simple drums. The production is also pretty mellow, and aside from the vocals, there's nothing all that abrasive about the band. This layer is going to be pretty short. I was thinking of including other bands, but I didn't really want to water down the layer with Black and Screamo / emo, so I did. The first band in the second layer is Neurosex with the EP Die With. This EP is pretty wild actually. The vocals are most definitely DSBM inspired, but the rest is this really trippy post-punk, I want to say. If you aren't a fan of more experimental acts, just don't even try. The next one will probably be highly contested, but anyway, here it goes. It's Hakun by Heaven in Our Arms. It's a great black metal / post-hardcore release. I agree that most songs aren't even remotely close to what the video is about. However, there is a big, overwhelming sort of feeling of pent-up anger. I feel like I'm 14. Which, in my opinion, bridges the gap to the next artist perfectly. If you want to explore this sort of little niche of blackened screamo, I've linked the playlist below if you're interested. Now on to the next artist, which is Cultura Coreña, with their full-length Necrophilia. Honestly, I can go on for hours about how good this album is, and I mean, I also like most of the band's discography, but I'll try to keep it short. A lot of the depressing factor has to do with the vocals and their little melodic sections, which are spread throughout the album, which are always a treat. The production is also surprisingly good. Like, it sounds post-hardcore even during the more DSBM sections, but I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. This layer is mostly made up of fags that use elements that are common across various metal subgenres. Again, not all of them are strictly DSBM. I'll start us off with Clyde, I guess. I was gonna include them as one of the first acts in the black metal layer, but they rank pretty low on the true code spectrum. The vocals are also pretty ambiguously metal, so I was like, might as well include them in this layer. The next album, which is called black metal again, is Depressive Black Art by Taveron. Taveron tend to be on the faster side, at least for DSBM. The instrumentation is kind of mellow sounding, and the vocals are pretty mild and have that black metal vibe. Probably because they're black metal vocals, I don't know. Now on to the first DSBM artist of the layer. I have to admit, Begotten is pretty standard DSBM for the most part. There are, however, a lot of little bits that don't really conform to the norm, like the outro of Malaise. If you aren't keen on the idea of quirky DSBM, I'd say give the title track a spin. A big part of it is just a simple drum beat with a straightforward guitar melody. And finally, Everything is Horrible by Melancholic Despair. And yes, indeed, everything is horrible, including the vocals. I'm just kidding, I love you guys. Melancholic Despair is DSBM. I mean, true DSBM. But the songs are very reminiscent of rock and heavy metal. And that's not just because of the rock solos, which there's a lot of them. The drums are as simple as it gets, and the guitar parts rely on catchiness to sort of reel you in, just like rock. Yes, again, I do know Doom is a subgenre of metal. I just didn't think the bands quite fit the metal there. Of course, Doom is a humongous genre, and these bands are sort of closer to funeral doom than other subgenres of doom. The whole lyric goes from basically funeral doom to basically atmospheric DSBM, there's a bit of a mix of both. If you like the last few bands, you might want to check out more atmospheric black metal. Yet, I've linked a playlist in the description. Starting off with one of my top albums of 2023 is Yamiuta by Kanashima, the perfect middle ground between Pure Doom and DSBM. The ambient guitars mix well with the cold synths and the simplistic drums, and they just create the perfect ambiance. The whole thing is more original and mature than their previous works, and deserves a listen for sure. Like, one of the top albums of 2023, I swear to God. This next one might stand out to you because it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the layer per se. 119:107 is an album by the kind of post-black metal but not really band Autumn Leaves Scars. I say kind of post because their sound is very nuanced and I don't really want to reduce them to a label. The rhythm guitar tone is much more bottom heavy than Kanashima, though the vibe is pretty similar. The only difference is Kanashima is more zen, while here there's palpable tension. Also there's cool simple solos. Column 3. Moving on to the more straightforward act, that act being None, with their best album to date, Damn Chill of Life. Yes, I don't like the new one, I don't claim it, sue me. Here you can start seeing the transition from Kanashima to more traditional DSBM. Of course, the simplistic drums and the synths are still here, even if at least the synths aren't as pronounced. The only real change is the guitars, which are leaning more towards DSBM now. Stylistically speaking, it's pretty obvious that Goodbye Love, Hello Heartache by Hanging Garden is a classic example of DSBM. I'd say it's pretty close to Kanashima in the sense that it feels very sluggish and repetitive, but still it doesn't feel as heavy. And yes, I'm still talking about Kanashima. I just love Yamiuta. Go check it out. The band has also decided to put 2 clean songs at the end, which I totally respect. I love me some good clean guitar with the occasional freaks and screams. Okay, hear me out now. This band is basically depressing lo-fi mixed with metal. The songs are drawn out and repetitive. Of course there's distant sounding synths because we're in layer 4. This layer, it's impossible to not have distant sounding cold synths. We finally got to the first band in the layer that uses black metal drum beats, which is a development. They use them sparsely, but the point still stands. Raw sensations of nostalgia and nihilistic, which that is the whole name of the album, by Astaroth, is the last album but the first chapter. The album is atmospheric DSBM again, and it's marginally more true than the last one, but it's up to debate honestly. Like, the last few artists are pretty close in terms of sound. If you already like black metal or bands of the previous layers, there should be something you'll enjoy in here. I'll start us off with some bands that are closer to the ones in the previous layer. Then we'll talk about acts that are closer to plain black metal. And after that, I'll finally recommend some quote-unquote textbook DSBM, which I'll try to explain the term as best as I can. It's something I just made up because I think it fits, but I think if you already are somewhat familiar with the genre, you'll know what I'm talking about. And then finally, I'll just close out the chapter with some acts that fit the wall of sound aesthetic, which again isn't an actual thing, you'll see what I mean. This might seem kind of weird, but this layer is made up of bands similar to the ones in the first chapter. From personal experience, the more melodic and toned down aspects of DSBM don't really seem to click as easy for traditional black metal fans. That's why I decided to add this sort of intermediary layer. It's also an easy introduction to black metal if you aren't a fan already. If you already like a body from the first chapter, this next band might be right up your alley. The band is called Fat Height with a D. Their only album, Inhaling the Trauma, is a bit heavier than a body and definitely more black metal. They're still pretty sort of riff focused, though they share the grooviness of a body. For sadness fans, I'd recommend Willows. I personally recommend their most recent album,
Begeerte,
which is somewhat reminiscent of Sadness. However, it's more varied. It incorporates traditional and post-black metal elements, but it's still firmly rooted in DSBM. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to include this album here. It tends to deviate from the black gaze sound a bit. It incorporates elements which are mostly found in the last layer. However, the closing track is pretty loud and melodic, and it sounds a whole lot like Sadness. An Autumn for Crippled Children is another one of those not quite DSBM bands that always get put on DSBM playlists, and then purists argue it isn't DSBM. But anyway, their sound on Try Not to Destroy Everything You Love is closer to black gaze, I'd say, though it can't just be boiled to that label. It's definitely good soup, like good noisy synthy soup. Another big name in the genre is Euphoria, which is a side project that at this point is more famous than the main one. I have no idea how to read this, but yeah, this album is very melodic and clean sounding. This is in part, of course, due to the flawless production, which I really like when DSBM artists do good production. But I mean, credit where credit is due. The music itself is very introspective and somber, and it's not the heaviest, but it captures the atmosphere of the genre well. A DSBM act which heavily dabbles in atmospheric black metal, Wargale I think, makes for a pretty good band for your transition between the last chapter and this one. Their album, which I'm not gonna try to pronounce, often sounds DSBM-ish, but there are also songs which stray far from the quote-unquote textbook DSBM, like Anhedonia Part 2, for example. And in a similar vein, we have Departure by Sunken. While it also is pretty heavily inspired by atmospheric black metal acts, with all the long songs that keep dragging on and being interludes, there are a lot of commonalities with like the 2010s vanilla black metal. I was pretty close to including Faith's Take Me Away in the textbook DSBM layer. While it's true that some of the songs on there are textbook quote-unquote DSBM, a big part of the album explores more ambient and post soundscapes, and it's also on the lighter side of things, so I feel like it fits better in this layer. Next up, a record I absolutely love, and Ghost Bath's Funeral. The sound on here can be described as post-black metal that's just cranked up to 11. The instrumentation is more abrasive than post-black metal acts, even though they still retain a prominent lead guitar tone, which cuts through the rest of the mix. And they also have great crying vocals. In general, they're great for like your entry-level post/DSBM. Similar to Ghost Bath, but I mean, not really, is Psychonaut 4. Most people don't bring up their best, which, yes, objectively best album, Have a Nice Trip. It's also their debut. I hated the vocals the first time I listened to them, but kind of like with Silencer in the next layer, you just learn to love them. Also, the album art must be like one of my favorite album arts ever in any genre. So I'm just gonna quickly talk about the Bresic so we can move on. Their EP 1962 is very on brand for this layer, though I'd say it's marginally heavier. I mean, I can also see it fitting in the next layer because there are a lot of like basic and repetitive sounds which also fit more vanilla black metal. Logically speaking, the first DSBM band should be the closest to vanilla black metal, right? Well, there's some arguments. Some people say the first DSBM act is Burzum, but others claim it's Strid with their first demo, End of Life. The record has that solid second wave of black metal foundation, but it replaces the aggression that's common for their contemporaries with more somber and gloomy vibe, which Burzum also does, so you decide for yourself. Another album, this time closer to modern black metal. I don't want to pronounce it. The premise is pretty similar. The artist just took out the Hail Satan, Do Crack and Abortions out of early to mid 2010s black metal. The songs are structured more like DSBM. They're heavily melody focused, pretty repetitive. And if you don't like synths, this album is perfect for you. Continuing with the pretty vanilla but not really trend we got going, next up, an open letter with their self-titled. Again, as you might notice, there is a big focus on melodies in this layer, just as most layers up to now. This record also has a lot of clean interludes, which are another DSBM staple. And now, it's finally time, boys. Prepare yourself for the Screamy Man album. Death Pierce Me by Silencer. When I first heard the vocals on this album, I laughed my ass off. I swear, it was the funniest thing ever. But then over time, something just started clicking, and I started appreciating just how disturbing these vocals can be. Combined with the matching low quality production, this record will surely invoke a visceral reaction. I mean, even if it's amusement. Continuing with the theme of bad vocals, we have Happy Days with one of their most famous albums, Happiness Stops Here. While it is a staple DSBM release, it doesn't really get me in the staring at a wall for hours mood, but I just feel like it's important to mention it. And like, they aren't bad, I'm not the biggest fan. While we're discussing DSBM classics, here's another one. Austere's Delay Like Old Ashes is similar to the previous record, even though they don't sound all that similar. The similarities are in how both utilize vanilla black metal and then tack on elements of DSBM. I'd say Austere's record dabbles more in the serene sounds, more in the post, that type of stuff, but that's just about the only difference. Okay, so I sort of made the video just to talk about this next release, because it's probably my favorite DSBM/DSBM adjacent release ever. It's the Trist and Lone Summer Split. The Trist part, I mean, you know, Trist is decent, they're fine, very atmospheric, and overall just good too. But the reason why it's my favorite DSBM record is Lone Summer. The vocals are like peak DSBM, and the riffs are straight up just the catchiest black metal riffs I've ever heard. The whole atmosphere just reminds me of being stuck at home while it's raining cats and dogs outside. Textbook DSBM is something I just made up, and it's not the most descriptive name ever, even though there are a number of different sounds that fall under the DSBM umbrella. This is what people would call the purest quote-unquote form of DSBM. And just quick note here, black metal fans love to bicker, so you might not agree with my picks or how I define textbook DSBM. Now, let's kick it off with a band that might have gotten the most people into DSBM. Thy Light's CD Pressure. Yeah, that's their most famous and arguably best work. It features great production, at least by black metal standards, which doesn't say much, but hey. And some of the most fitting DSBM solos, which DSBM and solos don't go that well together, so I'm really impressed by bands that can actually manage it. The first band I came up with for this layer is Fentanyl, and I wasn't 100% sure they would fit the layer. I wouldn't necessarily call the vocals DSBM. They're deeper and not as whiny, but there's still the occasional whimpering line. If that doesn't really matter to you, the instrumentation is pretty much, yeah, just textbook DSBM. There are some artists that are just disturbing for no apparent reason. Like, for example, I have no idea why, but From the Ocean Aviation Returns by Throwing the Light just gives me the heebie-jeebies. And same goes for I'm in a Coffin. They just creep me out, and I'm not even sure why. Especially the song Slave to My Skin, but I guess there the vocals sound like some really disturbed individual is singing. Hikan is another prominent act from the Brazilian DSBM scene. A Breath of Sorrow for a Dying Spirit is a great album with a pretty straightforward attitude towards the genre. And yeah, there is a short segment in Do Blade that sounds like black and roll, but that's just about the only weird thing. On
Abkehr. Lichtblick.
have gone a bit overboard with the clean sections. On the whole, the album is pretty slow, but due to the length of the song, they usually still have plenty of time for like a mid-tempo, loudish climax. I found myself struggling to pick only one release from My Useless Life's catalog. Their self-titled is probably an easier listen and a classic of the genre, but I personally prefer On the Edge. The production is worse, yeah, but that just gets me in the mood. Like, bad production works if it works. I mean, both are equally depressing, so it's just personal preference, really. I'd say for beginners, the self-titled might be better. Absurdism by SAR should be the standard for DSBM. The vocals are the genre snore, crying vocals. The sound is quite rough and abrasive, and an exception to that is the clean sections, which there are a lot of those. If you aren't deterred by the very loud and punchy drums, which I usually would be, Exiled from Lights, There Is No Beauty Left Here has a lot to offer to you. Aside from the drums, everything is in fact quite ambient. The full version also has tracks from other side projects like Funereal, which offers a cleaner, in terms of production at least, doomier sound. Deadleaf's take on DSBM on When You Close Your Eyes is one of the more quirky out of this subcategory. The tone is quite clear on a lot of these songs, but still sounds pretty cold and hostile. Other times it just feels like it belongs on the next layer. My Mind is Too Weak to Forget by Dreariness is one of the more famous examples of DSBM with female vocals, which, by the way, is like its own thing, I guess. So if you want, you can peep the playlist and description and see for yourself. I personally like it a lot. Yeah, anyways, back to Dreariness. The vocals are great and all, but without good instrumentation, the songs would be nothing. Considering how much I dislike drums that are too loud in the mix, I can say they've actually incorporated loud drums pretty well. It's alright. They don't take from the great synths and guitar melodies, and of course the vocals. My favorite DSBM singer is the vocalist of Sacramone, Lifeless, Angoranime, and more. Sacramone is probably my favorite project of the bunch, with Lifeless coming in a close second. The album Reflections on My Unaliving Melancholy was my favorite DSBM release up until I found Lonesomer. The guitar tone is perfect for DSBM, clean enough to where the leads are clear but still ambient enough for the repetitive rhythm sections. And the case is similar with Lifeless's inner shouts from a sad soul. However, the female vocals there are used more often, even though I'd say in terms of instrumentation it's pretty similar. If you like it when you have no idea what's going on in the song, then this layer is perfect for you. I'm not throwing shade, but I also sometimes feel like listening to static noise and a metronome in the background at the same time. Jokes aside, bands in this layer rely on repetitiveness and that production even more. Even the artists that have horrible production usually have often repeating leads which cut through the mix. A pretty prominent name in the niche is Picazzo's. I personally recommend starting with Isolated from Life, the remastered version, because it just has more tracks. While they are on the lighter side of things, the production really does it for me. The vocals are low in the mix, which works, at least for this particular style of vocals. And something that really shocked me with the Taser when I first heard them is the bass. It's not just audible, it's actually extremely loud, which it partially contributes to the wall of sound effect. Life is Pain's only demo, Bloody Melancholy, is another great release that is sadly too short. The ambiance is great on this one. The bad production gives it an ambient sound, but that gives the shrieking vocals that sometimes remind me of Silencer a more defined place in the mix. Waldstille is one of the most underrated acts in this whole video. I originally got into them because of the 3-minute long sample at the start of Shivering. It's still one of my all-time favorite samples, by the way. And I still recommend the whole Nerves of Trees. The obnoxious hi-hat might ruin your immersion, but if you get past that, you're pretty much left with some top-notch vocals and quality DSBM riffs. The next one is kinda quirky. Sketches of Reality by Nameless does a lot of different things and combines them pretty well under the guise of DSBM. I love the synth lines in the opener. They're lethargic throughout the song and keep the overall tone depressing, while the closing track, on the other hand, is much more closer to ambient with its clean interludes, more traditional riffs. This just goes to show how diverse the whole album is. Aesthetic is yet another album on this list that is heavily inspired by ambient, but unlike Nameless, Grisotra don't really speed up and instead focus on drone-based ambience. The guitars and drums are also on the softer side, with the ode to familiar repetitive synths in the background. Now, this next EP stood out to me because of how much it made me think about what genre it actually fits. In the end, I just decided to call it dejected ambient slash raw black metal. And yeah, it isn't that extraordinary. It's pretty easy to get into, for DSBM fans at least. But I mean, it has its own fresh take on the genre. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot to put it in the script, but the outro is kind of random. Just like an 8.5 minute long piano track. This quote unquote EP is basically just one longish song. The first and third part are very noisy and sort of angsty, while the second one is just two clean guitars and a drum kit doing their thing. It sounds dreamy, at least, but it just has that slight hint of sadness. Zaster has one of the weirdest catalogs in DSBM, ranging from pretty traditional black metal and DSBM to dark neo-folk and even like ambient electronic. There's something for everyone. This album, to violate the oblivious, this album alone is an example of that. Walker of Dissonant Worlds is my favorite song of theirs, and it's pretty ambient, it's pretty repetitive, and it has like this very, very depressing feeling. While this rendition of A Gate Through Bloodstained Mirrors, for example, exudes a lot more energy and is just overall much closer to standard black metal.